Welcome to the Clandestine Radio Podcast, Season 2.
Good evening, curious minds out there across the internet, and welcome back to the Clandestine Radio Podcast. As always, I'm your host, DJ Joswa, and you are tuned in to Season 2, Episode 6, The Hidden Hand, Part 2, Bloodlines and the Dark Side. In Part 1 of this series, we took a look back at the original Illuminati and its merger with the Masonic lodges, and then kind of a brief, partial, look at some of the historical events in which their influence played a key role, and began discussing the 13 Illuminati bloodlines, if you will. I'm sure there are hardcore conspiracy theorists out there right now who probably feel like I went way too easy, played too safe, and didn't yet address the giant satanic elephant in the room. To those who may feel that way, just please bear with me. We will lay it all out before we're done, but we had to start somewhere. I thought for a long time about how to best get into all of this material and how to try to cover it accurately, honestly, and as thoroughly as possible. I want to make this a definitive series on the topic, and one that even someone who has never looked into this or considered this subject at all before could listen to it and get a full picture by the end. In order to do this, though, I felt that establishing some background and the most easily verified info available first would be the logical starting point to it all. Those who are on the other side of things and to this point have been skeptical of this topic, you may already feel that we've gone too far with things. And by the end of this episode, you may think that it's all crazy talk. To those people, I get it. I was extremely skeptical of a lot of this myself, especially going into this one. And I still am, as you will see at points, of a lot of it. But I will encourage you to look up the things that I talk about, and to try to keep an open mind about the things that may seem a bit far-fetched at first. A lot of what you will learn will force you to reevaluate much of what you have been taught and brought up to believe. And accepting that you may have been deceived is never an easy ask for anybody. Your logical mind and your pride will compel you to doubt, to reject, to deny things that would require changing your long-held beliefs on the nature of the world around you, the structure of society, and the depths that others will go to in order to gain and maintain money and power. Unless you're a megalomaniac, or at very least a narcissist yourself, it's going to be hard at times to understand how far these types of individuals will go to get what they want. We have an innate tendency to give people the benefit of the doubt, to think the best of others, especially if we're conditioned by the media and institutions to do so for all of our lives. I'm not asking you to believe everything that I say. I never will. I always ask simply that you do your own research, and that you think for yourself. I ask that you leave any preconceived notions at the door as best you can, and that you join me once again on this journey of truth and discovery, as we wrap up the bloodlines of the Illuminati, discuss the players that I feel, at least, are left out of this list, but that play a major role in the big picture, and as we dive into the dark side of all of this, and the depths of depravity that a lot of these wealthy and influential families will stoop to in order to get the things that they desire. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start this show by finishing up our list with the top 5 Illuminati bloodlines. Part 1.5, It Runs in the Family, continued. For the first part of this list, I pretty much just stuck with Springmeier's order. This part, though, I'll be making a few small changes in the order so that I can try to make a few connections and to discuss some of the more lengthy parts of all of this towards the end. Just please bear in mind, especially with the first part of the Bloodlines that I've discussed, I'm attempting to condense a massive amount of research and information into a relatively minuscule section of this series. If you want to try and fully understand why some of these families are on this list, I would strongly encourage you to just pick up a copy of Springmeier's book on the 13 Bloodlines of the Illuminati and see all the research and information that he's compiled for yourself, and you can be the judge on if you think it's accurate, if it's not accurate, and you'll at least get a bunch more information that I simply could not include in this episode or in this series. It would, to be honest, be a whole season unto itself. But I also want to quickly discuss him for just a second. First, just to give an example of the reach of these people, and because I feel that it possibly speaks to the accuracy of some of his work. If you look up Fritz Springmeier, the first thing that you're probably going to see, aside from he writes books on conspiracy, but the next thing, and virtually all you will find out from sites like Wikipedia, is that he was convicted in 2003 of a quote-unquote bank robbery. First off, this is deceptive and inaccurate. Secondly, a lot of people would say that it reeks of a conspiracy itself, mostly due to the fact that it occurred shortly after he popped up in both the FBI and the CIA databases. I don't want to get too terribly sidetracked with his story because it's pretty lengthy and all over the place, but I think it's important to cover the basics at least and to dispel the main misconception that most commonly gets used in order to discredit his work. Springmeier is a very complicated case, and the truth about him will vary greatly depending on who you ask and who you trust, honestly. What is fairly clear to me is that the KATU news article that you will probably see pop up about Springmeier and his legal trouble, it was written by Eric Mason and John Stevens, and it is purposely deceptive, as well as a blatant hit piece that's full of unsubstantiated claims and smear tactics, as is the standard protocol that's used against individuals who the government and higher-ups find inconvenient for them. Of course, he's labeled as a possible terrorist, though never accused of such in any sort of legal way, a racist/white separatist, which his wife and his multicultural friends seem to vehemently deny and dispute. Ultra-right-wing extremist, which zero proof was ever given, and his writings make it pretty clear he didn't have a political leaning or enough faith in either wing to carry such beliefs. I could go on and on about this, but I won't. What's important is that after publishing his research, he was first accused of being a terrorist, and these charges proved to be false and then were later dropped. Then suspected of growing pot, and in 2001 the feds would raid a property where Forrest Bateman and Tony Huntington were living. Forrest knew Springmeier from Bible study class, and there's a lot of conflicting info about how well they really knew one another, but the feds would find an arsenal of weapons and about 50 cannabis plants. Huntington would then testify against Springmeier in exchange for a lighter sentence in regards to a 1997 bank robbery that Huntington was involved in, as well as a propane tank that was detonated as a diversion, which Springmeier was nowhere near either of these events, for the record. And only their testimony and very scant circumstantial evidence remotely connected him to the robbery in any sort of way. Fritz would still go down for it, though. Bateman and Huntington would get 111 months and 3 years, respectively, and Springmeier would be sentenced to 9 years. I've only done a very light bit of research into that case, to be totally clear with you guys, but noticing that charge was one of the only things listed on his Wikipedia, I just wanted to know who that was and why that is the case. And I felt that it might be important to discuss this to anyone else should you guys go and look him up and wonder why I'm talking about a bank robber and going off of his book. And while I personally feel that a lot of his work is worthy of consideration, I certainly don't buy all of it myself. I also don't think that he as a person should override the validity of his work, much of which I have cross-referenced, especially the stuff that I'm sharing in this series, and I've personally found supporting evidence for it as well. Now, with that much longer than intended detour there out of the way, let's get back to those bloodlines, shall we? Now, as I stated before, this order as far as 13 through 1 and their importance is definitely a subject of much debate and can be looked at a number of ways. I'm restructuring them somewhat in this later half for the sake of who holds the most power now and the evidence I was able to corroborate. Ultimately, it's the names that matter more than the hierarchy and what they've done. Number 5, Van Dyne bloodline. This is one of the least exposed bloodlines, and much of their connections and dealings remain very well guarded. They have ties back to the early Dutch families that settled New Amsterdam, which was later New York, of course. And before that, were a prominent family in the Netherlands with various old world associations through business and marriage. Moving to more modern times, Edward Seguin Van Dyne founded the Planned Parenthood Center of Syracuse, New York. This is one you either understand the significance of or would probably require a very lengthy history lesson to truly get, but it feeds into things we will discuss later, and the list of its major contributors, however, reads like a who's who of evil corporations and individuals, virtually all funneled through foundations. The family would also marry into several other powerful bloodlines like the Collins, Whitneys, and Vanderbilts. Van Dyne was supposedly the main go-between for the early intelligence apparatus, which is really just a part of a vast and interconnected web working totally in unison around the world, which we'll get into that in the third part of this series. Number 4, the Russell bloodline. This family has some interesting members and launched a very important American branch of the greater, shall we say, New World Order, for lack of a better term, hierarchical tree. When in 1832, along with Alphonso Taft, he founded Skull and Bones at Yale University. Bones, or the Order as it is commonly referred to, as a prominent secret society which has launched the careers of many of the power elites and former presidents. William Howard Taft, who was Alphonso's son, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush as well, along with many more leaders in the business and political worlds. The 2004 presidential election was between two bonesmen, George W. Bush and John Kerry. McGeorge Bundy, who we spoke of a little bit earlier, was also a member. Charles Taze Russell is another notable. He's a Knights Templar Mason of the York Rite and founder of the Watchtower Society. There's also a very long list of other notable family members, many Masons, and at least one connected to the Order of the Golden Dawn, and others to various satanic orders and secret societies. And they also started several of those, including the Pilgrim Society, which JFK's father belonged to. Now, for the top 3 families, which I'm sure for anyone familiar with this sort of content and information, none of these are going to be that big of a surprise for you. Number 3, the Rockefeller bloodline. Anyone who has even a cursory knowledge of this sort of information or has looked into who really controls the world at some point will be familiar with that name. And I'm sure you knew that we would get here eventually. Since just this family could easily provide enough material for at least its own 3-part series, I'll have to omit and condense quite a bit in this one. But I suppose we start back in 1910 with William Avery Rockefeller, who was, at least aside from paid-off revisionist historians and PR image handlers, widely considered an evil man without much in the way of morals. He was an occultist with many wives around the country, even more in the way of mistresses. He was charged with raping a woman in New York and fled the state to avoid arrest. There's a pretty long laundry list of occult and otherwise dastardly deeds attached to this guy, but let's move on to his kids. John Davidson Rockefeller, in his lifetime, became one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the world, facilitated secretly in these aims by the other Illuminati families, and guided by an unscrupulous and utterly ruthless desire for them both. Rockefeller would, of course, found the Standard Oil Company in 1870, through which he took that support and began his empire. By using his monopolies and underhanded business practices, he controlled 90% of the oil in the U.S. by 1900. In 1911, the Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil must be dismantled for violations of federal antitrust laws, and he broke it into 34 separate entities, which became everything from ExxonMobil, Texaco, Chevron, and a long list of pretty much every other oil company that you've ever heard of, effectively maintaining his monopoly under other names as shareholder and selling them off control-wise for massive profits, estimated at $900 million, almost 3% of the U.S. GDP for that year. No surprise, subsequent members of the family would prove no better, but taking a page from John Dee's late life playbook, they would get better and better at hiding their wealth and maintaining it tax-free through an absolutely massive list of foundations and philanthropic endeavors. Some notable companies they control are Texas Instruments, General Electric, and Kodak, as well as Boeing, which is said to have some very, very dark ties. I mean, aside from their poor business practices revealed as of late, including connections with a bit of conspiracy that I have thus far refrained from really covering in Monarch Mind Control. I touched on it briefly in episode 1 of this season, but at that time I'd seen no real evidence to support a real belief in the topic. My views, I'm very sad to say, are changing as of late, but while I lack any real evidence to support its connections with Boeing, I did find it interesting. The Rockefellers also control an unbelievable list of assets around the globe and played a role in the Lucius Trust, the FBI, and the UN. David Rockefeller, a champion of neoliberalism, befriended the Dulles brothers of CIA fame while he was in college and was a chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR. We'll get to them in a little while. And advised several U.S. presidents, helping to pull off such notable deep state activities as the 1953 CIA-backed Iranian coup to overthrow its democratically elected prime minister at the behest of international oil corporations. He was also a good pal of Henry Kissinger, which is a story for another day. The Rockefellers also pop up frequently in reference to satanic bloodlines and are said to be listed in a book detailing these bloodlines that is located in the cathedral in the basement of the Mothers of Darkness Castle in Belgium, which I'll talk a lot more about towards the end of this episode, but it was a seed that started this whole series, ironically enough. It was actually just going to be its own episode at one point, but while I was researching it, I stumbled onto so much more that I felt compelled, or perhaps guided, to keep going and to attempt to connect all of the dots of this puzzle. A feat I honestly, at this point, am pretty unsure of my qualifications to truly accomplish, but I feel a sense of duty to at least try to do it. There is so much more to the Rockefeller bloodline, far too much to cover tonight though. So in the interest of your time and the narrative, I'll go ahead and move on for now. This next one will be no surprise to you. Honestly, I feel like I should have probably just made it number 1, but out of respect for the work of Springmeier, I went ahead and left number 1 where it was. Number 2, the Rothschild bloodline. And as far as a single bloodline goes, it really doesn't get any bigger than this one. So much true and false, but still pretty believable writing has been done about these guys that the following research is the culmination of years of looking into them by myself, as well as countless others from a long list of authors. And while Springmeier gets full credit as the researcher who first really compiled this list of names, I myself spent weeks cross-referencing and fact-checking his writing with every available source, including official documents, other authors, my own research, but none were nearly as difficult as this bloodline to extract the facts from all of the still very believable fictions. I've struggled greatly with where to even begin discussing this family. No single family in the history of the world has managed to amass the level of wealth, power, and control as the Rothschild dynasty, by a pretty remarkable margin, might I add. While he is frequently quoted with the saying, "Give me control of the economics of a country and I care not who makes her laws," or some variation of that, there's no verifiable source for Mayer Amschel Rothschild having ever actually being quoted directly as saying this. The sentiment, however, is perfectly in line with the man's logic and his actions, so it's possible, but I just could not find any documented source for it. The word Rothschild is derived from the German Zum Rothenschild, meaning to the red shield, or with the red shield. Their original family name was Bacharach, But Mayer's grandfather, Isaac, would change the name to Rothschild, which was said to be a reference to their ancestral home, which bore a flag emblazoned with a red shield. At that time, houses were designated by flags and signs, and usually had like symbols and colors and stuff instead of the numbers that we use today. Just completely irrelevant to our story, but just a fun little random fact that you know now. Mayer's father had a goods trading and currency exchange business in Germany and was the personal supplier of coins to the Prince of Hesse. With a decent income and the help of other relatives, Mayer would somewhat follow in his father's footsteps and deal in rare coins, positioning himself close with the wealthy and the powerful at an early age. As he gained the title of court factor, or court Jew, this is absolutely what that's really called, that's not a slur in any way, to the crown of Germany. This position meant that he handled the finances of, or lent money to, royalty and nobility, and these were Jewish bankers who carried a great deal of power in their own rights, often being granted the status of nobles through ennoblement. His business would expand greatly following the French Revolution. He handled the payments from Britain to finance Hessian mercenaries. And when Napoleon invaded Hesse in 1806, sending even the Landgrave fleeing in exile, fellow Mason Napoleon would seemingly allow Rothschild to continue his banking work as he simply invested funds in London and even was allowed to circumvent Napoleon's continental blockade and profit off importing goods when virtually no one else was able to do so. In 1798, he would send his third son, Nathan Mayer Rothschild, to London with the modern equivalent of $2.8 million in capital to further the family's interest, and he would establish a bank there in 1804. And in 1810, Mayer would enter a partnership with his eldest three sons, founding M.A. Rothschild & Son. This would be the beginning of the Rothschild stranglehold over global finance operations. In 1811, the Grand Duke of Frankfurt enacted a special law which decreed that all Jews living in Frankfurt and their descendants should enjoy civil liberties and privileges equally with the other citizens. This came at a price, though, of course, of 440,000 florins, which was financed by, you guessed it, Mayer, netting him even greater profit and power. A number of Masonic Jews at that time would petition for and be granted exclusive right to maintain lodges in the city, granting Masonic Jews a great deal of newly found power. All five sons would later set off to various countries, establishing major banking institutions in each one, cementing the family's control over the banking and lending industries all across Europe. That's the official story, at least. The truth, of course, is a bit more complicated. When Napoleon invaded Frankfurt, the current rulers would, as legend has it, give their massive wealth over to Mayer Rothschild for safekeeping before fleeing the country. After Napoleon was later defeated at Waterloo in 1815, and Frankfurt was once again able to regain its independence, the Rothschilds were told to keep the wealth for 20 years and use it in business at a low interest rate. Nathan Rothschild, who witnessed the defeat of Napoleon, was one of the first to know of England's victory, and he supposedly fled the battlefield, landing in France, where he would buy shares of the stock market before the news would reach there and cause them to skyrocket, netting him another fortune. The financial and political maneuvering that ultimately positioned the Rothschilds at the head of the table, so to speak, of families that are highly instrumental in world events is a very long, winding, and probably pretty boring road to try and explain fully in a single episode. Instead, I'll just try to name some of the high points along that path and keep the speculation to a minimum, because there's no shortage of that out there either. Now that we have a foundation built in regards to how they gathered their early wealth, let's go back real quick and connect how they fit in overall and why they, above any other family, truly have a bloodline born of the Illuminati. At least one of Mayer Amschel's son was a member, as well as it is believed Mayer may have been as well. I said I would keep speculation to a minimum just a second ago, but records are not easy to come by for some of this, and I want to be upfront about what I believed and what is known. What is known is that Amschel sent each of his sons across Europe to establish the major banking houses. They would all go to work also establishing their own mini secret services and buying or quietly creating newspapers in order to outmaneuver the government that might stand in their way and to control any narrative that they wanted to spin in their favor. As the Illuminati was exposed and sunk into the shadows, the Alta Vendita rose to take its place, with Amschel's son, Karl, at the head. A now infamous document was sent out from the order to the Grand Masonic Lodge. Allegedly, the Masons became quite worried when a copy of this document was lost, and then they went about offering a reward for its immediate return. It was originally written in Italian, but its title translates to Permanent Instructions, Guides for the Heads of the Highest Grades of Masonry. According to the book 10,000 Famous Freemasons, Volume 4, page 74, indicates that two other of Amschel's sons were also powerful Masons, James Mayer and Nathan Mayer, and Solomon was initiated June 14, 1809. All were at least 31 to 33 degree or comparable and became very powerful and influential within Masonry. The Rothschilds were also prominent members in two other powerful groups that we'll touch on later, those being the Bilderbergs and the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR. Bringing it further home for my U.S. listeners, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is far from federally controlled or connected, was controlled by 5 banks which owned 53% of its stock. All 5 of those banks were controlled by Nathan M. Rothschild and Sons of London. In Eustace Mullins' book, Who Owns the TV Networks?, he shows that the Rothschilds have control of all 3 major U.S. networks, along with control of other music and mass media companies. There is an exhaustively long and well-documented connection of the Rothschilds back to the Illuminati, going back to the Oppenheimer Bank that Mayer Amschel first apprenticed at, Oppenheimer's being a powerful family within the original Illuminati as well, and running back up all the way through Kabbalism and occult practices to the creation of the State of Israel, through financing every major war from both sides, through control over the finances of most of Europe and America to this day. To lay it all out would take more time than I have, and admittedly, I struggled just to cohesively condense what we did go over into this, so let's move on. Just know that for one willing to truly dig and read, there is no shortage of information out there about these guys, and outside of sources that are under their control, which is most of them if we're gonna be honest, very little of it is good in any sort of way. And now for number 1, the Merovingian bloodline. Perhaps the most interconnected but least understood of all the bloodlines is the Merovingians. This is an earnest where the old world ruling bloodlines take their root. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Merovingians would step into the power vacuum that was left behind. They would ultimately reshape the political map of Europe and rule continually for over 250 years, before essentially being usurped by the Carolingian dynasty. Their long and often unkempt hair distinguished them from the other Franks who commonly kept their hair short, and they were often referred to as the long-haired kings. A Merovingian who cut his hair actually wasn't considered to be fit to rule. In recent times, they have been often attributed as the secret bloodline of Christ and Mary Magdalene, all that. I'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end of this, though. But to give you an accurate look at this bloodline without the hooey that gets connected to them, let me attempt to briefly condense their start and some high points related to their nearly 3-century reign that they had. The dynasty gets its name from Merowig or Merovic, which linguistic differences, a lot of contrary information on it. It was a Salian Frank leader from 447 AD to 457 AD. His claim to fame as the start of their ruling line was actually his son Childeric I, who won a number of battles against the Saxons, the Visigoths, the Alemanni, and Childeric would use his military prowess to carve out a kingdom, and the Merovingian dynasty would grow from there. As with many of the ruling houses of the time, an aggrandized mythological backstory that somehow gave them ordained authority to rule would become attached to them. In the case of the Merovingians, that tale was of Claudio and his wife, Merovic's parents, talking about here, and their stay by the sea one summer. This is when his wife had gone to bathe in the waters and was gawked at by a Kinotar, which is, and I shit you not, basically a merbull. So this fish cow thinks, yeah, I'd like a piece of that, and somehow has sex with her and gets her knocked up, later giving birth to Merovik. This was regarded as an authentic piece of German mythology, for the record. Like, people for centuries truly believed that that is where this bloodline came from. Merovik, by the way, translates to sea bull. I guess you have to explain a name like that somehow. They were pagans in belief, as a majority of people were at this time in Europe, and known for their fierce brutality. They would conquer their way around Europe, pillaging anyone they defeated and splitting the spoils among the warriors and the king, each man receiving a share according to his origins and worth. One popular target for their plundering was actually the Holy Roman Catholic Church, which still held many riches from the empire's golden days. Their culture was very much a trickle-down economy that lacked the sense of responsibility to their citizens that had been seen with the Romans, and decisions were made not for the sake of bettering the kingdom as a whole, but for the benefit of the nobles alone. They would later convert to Christianity under the rule of King Clovis I, grandson of Merovik. Clovis had married a Burgundian woman named Clotilda, lovely name, who was a Roman Catholic and wanted her children to be raised as Christians. Clovis agreed to this, but he himself remained a pagan. This would all change, however, during the battle against the Alemanni, which were a confederation of Germanic tribes with considerable numbers. Clovis, knowing he was fighting a losing battle, hit his knees and vowed that if this god of Clotilda's would give him victory, that he too would convert to her faith. As fate would have it, the battle would turn to his favor after this, and the battle was won by the Franks. Clovis would keep his vow, and in 496 AD, he would be baptized and become a Roman Catholic, which had to be a little awkward. Like, thanks for the bath, sorry about all that looting and plundering stuff we did. While his conversion would be a significant historical impact culturally, Clovis and his army would remain as warlike and vicious as ever, and continue their ways of using brutality and treachery to defeat their enemies in battle. They would, however, become a powerful ally of the Pope in promoting Christianity, forcefully, and the promotion of it would result in the spread of Christianity to England. Their brutal methods would often still prove detrimental to the church, though, and the Merovingians would still view the church as a source of income to be used for profit. They would deeply infiltrate the Catholic Church and appoint laymen as bishops in order to sell their offices for money or favor. Their connection to the church may have still contributed to the later theories in regards to their divine lineage. Speaking of, let's discuss that real quick. So the theory goes that Christ actually escaped death on the cross by being cut down right before his actual death, and then being smuggled out along with the pregnant Mary Magdalene, where he would arrive in southern France. In this theory, the Holy Grail is interpreted as the royal blood, sang real, that is the pregnant Mary. Jesus and Mary would go on to establish a dynasty there with their children, going on to become the Merovingian kings, perhaps completely unaware of their divine ancestry. So is there any real evidence of this? As far as primary sources go, bear in mind that very little in the way of sources relating to their origin has survived to this day. The Decum Libri Historiarum, or Chronicle of Fredgar, neither one make any mention of it. No other letters, capitularies, or other contemporary or even later surviving documents has any sort of mentions of it. And let's not forget, there is plenty of, quote, evidence that openly claims that they were descended from a mythological bullfish, which is exactly what this is, if you ask me. So claiming crazy or fantastical origins were honestly right in their wheelhouse. No mentions of descending from the Son of God by them, or any credible historians can be found though. Their pagan roots and vicious methods would seem to show if they did descend from Christ, they certainly forgot whatever it was that he taught them. As far as I can tell, this theory seems to come exclusively from Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code and Michael Bagnier and Richard Lee's Holy Grail, Holy Blood novels, and claims made seemingly without any evidence of proof therein. There is, though, quite a bit of historical evidence to support Jesus' death by crucifixion. So with one often cited myth about them, I feel at least, adequately put to bed, let's discuss what connections they do have that matter. They were the bloodline from which the first king of France was born. In fact, the name Clovis somehow evolved into the name Louis, a name that remained common among French royalty all the way up to the 19th century. Their dynasty left a lasting legacy on French history and culture, and their reign laid the foundation for the development of the French nation, as well as establishing Paris as a cultural and political center. Paris was the capital of the Merovingian kingdom, by the way. Through the Carolingians, which would not only usurp the throne, but also rejoin, genetically speaking, later on with the Merovingians, you get the continuation of the royal blood that gives us everyone from Charlemagne all the way through Napoleon III, as well as allegedly from George Washington to George W. Bush. Allegedly. I say allegedly because genealogy can be a tricky and easily manipulated to support one's viewpoint type of beast. I've seen a lot of these claims repeated over and over from various alternative and even some well-respected sources. I'm very apprehensive to put too much stock in these varying bloodlines or to try and interpret much real meaning from what is implied by them, especially considering there is already a very real abundance of proof regarding the levels of corruption and consolidated control of a ruling elite through the use of just their enormous wealth and the organizations by which they influence governments and dictate policies around the world. I will admit, though, that genealogical connections are compelling, and if nothing else, do seem to reflect that at very least they look out for their own, and the bloodlines seem to hold some degree of meaning in some circles at least. The issue lies in all of the researchers who have spent countless hours and years upon years of their lives tracing back and focusing on this blood element only to eventually hit a wall that seemingly ends with the conclusion that the ruling power has always remained within the same few families across time. While that is an interesting fact, it takes us nowhere of any real meaning. It leaves us the same as we started, feeling powerless, because, as the late great George Carlin once said, it's a big club and you ain't in it. You and I are not in the big club. I included all of this in this series because I feel that the key to understanding the control matrix starts with understanding that one exists and how it started, how it spread, who's responsible, and what it became. This is critical if we're ever to have a prayer at stopping or breaking free from at some point that matrix. I first read Sun Tzu's The Art of War when I was 13. Since then, I've read it no less than 30 times because it applies to your life differently as your life changes. I think this quote from that book best summarizes why this knowledge is so important. Quote, "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle." End quote. So as those once wise prophets Rage Against the Machine once put it, know your enemy. Particularly in this age of constant monitoring and data harvesting, I assure you that they know you. Perhaps better even than you know yourself. So let's discuss how all these bloodlines and secret societies have coalesced into the very machine that we now must rage against. Before we move on and discuss these vast, varied clubs and the giant network that all of it truly is, I feel it's important to discuss a very dark topic. One I've done my best to mostly avoid up to this point, and that is the reality and depth of what is meant by satanic bloodlines. Many of the families mentioned so far, and sadly so many more, are to a varying degree connected to what we're about to discuss. As hard as this information may be for some to believe, and even harder to stomach in some cases, it is the truth, and it's imperative to understand in order to fully grasp what is really going on, why, and what we are truly governed and opposed by. Until obtaining the legal documents that I needed to verify this information, it was an element of all of this that I knew existed to some degree, but one area that I opted not to cover, simply due to the fact that it is so disgusting and outlandish that I knew it would be difficult for most to accept, and I feared it may cause people to tune out or reject the rest of my research altogether. I also didn't want to accept it, to be completely honest. I wanted it to be wrong. Just a conspiracy theory created to tarnish the reputations of the wealthy elites by those that were disgusted by their excess. The word satanic gets tossed around a lot and has all throughout history. alchemy is satanic. Every woman who acts weird or that we don't like is a satanic witch. Burn her. Improper dress, long hair, rock and roll, heavy metal, all satanic, right? The list goes on and on. While there is a thread of truth in some examples of all of those things, I'm sure you can see how it is a label that has been thrown around frequently and in blanket fashion over any and everything that certain people don't approve of, like, or understand fully. So it should be at least somewhat understandable that I would be skeptical of its use as it applies to something that so many already dislike and so few are a part of fully. In this case, however, there is pretty solid evidence to support these claims. It doesn't matter how silly it may sound to you, or if you personally even believe in Satan at all, because the ones we're about to discuss most certainly do. And their actions, some very well documented, believe it or not, will reflect that belief. What I'm about to go over is very important to the fabric of this entire network, to understand how much of it fits together and why so many in high positions are complicit. That being said though, some of it is very disturbing, and some of you may find the following information, or at least parts of it, triggering, or at least very unsettling. It involves dark topics, and while I would do my very best to avoid the more graphic material and spare you the truly horrific details, if you believe that this is going to cause you to relive any personal trauma or cause you serious distress in any way, then please skip to the end of this episode or rejoin us in part 3. I may allude back to some of this material later in like quick references, but without the details that I'll be sharing next, and you should be able to get the big picture without having to have heard this part. So if you feel that it will cause you distress, again, I totally understand. I'll talk to you in the next episode. Your mental health and well-being is far more important to me than you getting this bit of information. And for those with a need to hear the whole truth, though, go ahead and buckle up. Part 2. Chateau De Armerois and the Satanic Elite. A strange part of all of this, and something that has been actively refuted, and air quotes here, debunked, with great fervor, but signs of it seemingly keep popping up progressively more and more lately, is that many of the global elites still believe in and actively work in the interest of the ancient pagan gods, such as Baal, Moloch, and Baphomet, as well as some who practice various forms of witchcraft, Kabbalism, and other branches of the ancient mystery religion. This can be traced back into history and would seem to be a leitmotif among the ruling class. It sounds absurd, trust me. I thought it was ridiculous as well. The more I've dug, however, the more I've found. Baphomet seems ubiquitous in music and Hollywood these days. Fun fact, there's actually a giant statue of him in downtown in 5 Points in Birmingham, Alabama, if you're ever in the area. Go check that out. I found it kind of strange that it was there. There's a 40-foot tall concrete representation of Moloch in the Bohemian Grove, and that's where the elite gather annually to perform a mock human child sacrifice in their cremation of care. Plenty of videos of that if you want to go check it out. Alex Jones is the one that infiltrated and recorded it, but Bohemian Grove's some pretty messed up stuff in and of itself. As for Baal, well, a whole lot of the torture and sexual abuse that has been surfacing more and more as of late actually ties back to service of him. Perhaps the best way to explain and illustrate this reality is through a little completely factual and very well documented true crime story and a short history about a place called Chateau De Armerois, or as it's perhaps better known as, Mothers of Darkness Castle. Located deep in the woods, around 12 kilometers from Bouillon, Belgium, lies a heavily guarded castle surrounded by state-of-the-art security systems as well as electric fencing, barbed wire, and tripwires. The property was originally purchased in 1849 by the Count of Mesnil, who then sold it to Theodore van der Noot, 8th Marquis of Asch. 10 years later, it would be sold to Prince Philip, Count of Flanders, and brother to King Leopold II, who, for the record, is part of the Saxe-Coburg and Gotha line, which can be traced back through Vlad the Impaler all the way up to the modern royals, to Queen Elizabeth and the newly crowned King Charles. A fire would break out and destroy most of the original castle in 1873, but it would be rebuilt between 1874 and 1877, with special attention being paid to the chapel. In 1905, Prince Philip would pass away, leaving it to his 3 children. Not a lot is known about what all took place up until this point, but according to the stories that have surfaced since, the castle's true dark history would really begin when it would later be sold to Alice Savoy, niece of Ernest Savoy, and one of the richest and most powerful families in the Belgian elite. They own several of the biggest pharmaceutical and chemical companies in the world and are responsible for drugs like Prozac, as well as much of the fluoride used in toothpaste and drinking water, which is definitely a conversation for another episode. We may dip into our toes into that at some point. The name Mothers of Darkness is in reference to a coven of witches that are said by many insiders to meet at the castle to perform rituals and come from very old satanic bloodlines. Now, as crazy as this may sound, much proof exists to support these claims, including court documents, which we will get into in just a second. These witches are conditioned through the use of satanic ritual abuse from a very young age. This is a very old form of programming and conditioning which is done through sexual abuse and torture to cause a dissociative personality disorder to form, fracturing their minds into multiple personalities, each serving a different purpose. This was an element of MKUltra as well as Monarch programming. The elite hold rituals here such as Eyes Wide Shut. Yes, like the film, which may have been what led to Kubrick's passing, which is also a story for another episode. Leave it in the Q&A if you want me to cover it. This ritual involves the abuse of children, that's all I'm going to say, and it's videotaped to be used as blackmail, to keep people quiet and under control. The corruption of innocence is possibly the most powerful ritual aside from actual sacrifice, and is done to please Baal and to gain power. For all of you who may be thinking, this sounds crazy, or where's the proof? Some of you may be familiar with the scandal that rocked Belgium in the 1990s and almost led to a full-on revolution in the country involving a man named Marc Dutroux. Again, this would be a good time to give you guys that trigger warning. If you feel like, if you're already getting a little uncomfortable, I would strongly encourage you to join us back in part 3, because it's not going to get any brighter from here. In Belgium and the surrounding area, children were going missing in alarming numbers from the mid-1980s through the late 1990s. Dutroux was a lifelong petty criminal and scumbag. By 1987, as an unemployed electrician, mind you, he had somehow acquired various land holdings, which was later attributed to money gained by auto theft and pimping. In 1989, Dutroux would be convicted of 5 sexual assaults, as well as the abduction of the young girls involved, and sentenced to 13 years in prison. Of those 13, he would only serve 3, during which time he would receive checks from the government, allowed visitation and given privileges above those of other prisoners. He would take that money that he gained while in prison, and when he got out, he would purchase more properties. In the basement of several of these houses, he would build sadistic dungeons in secret. His release was granted by the Belgian Minister of Justice against the advice of both the public prosecutor and his psychiatrist who examined him during his prison sentence, that had actually stated Dutroux remained extremely dangerous and disturbed. As I mentioned, Dutroux owned several properties after his release, 7, at least 3 of them which he used for the rape and torture of girls that he would abduct. Despite multiple tips from the community for years, including even Dutroux's own mother, police would consistently be prevented from investigating by their higher-ups. On June 24, 1995, 8-year-old classmates Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau would be kidnapped by Dutroux and brought to one of his houses. Dutroux would keep them imprisoned in his makeshift dungeon where he would repeatedly sexually abuse, torture, and make films of all of it with them. 2 months later, in the early hours of August 23rd, Dutroux and an accomplice would abduct 2 more young teenage girls and return them to his house. With Lejeune and Rousseau still in the basement dungeon, they would chain these 2 new girls up in a bedroom where more of the same would take place, before taking them to Jumet, where Dutroux and accomplice Bernard Weinstein would murder them by burying them alive, When a van used by them was later discovered by police and Weinstein was wanted for questioning, Dutroux decided to kill him to prevent him from talking, but not before torturing the whereabouts of his money out of him and then burying him alive on one of the properties as well. Dutroux would be arrested in '95 on other charges, and he told another accomplice to feed Lejeune and Rousseau, who were still in his basement, but his accomplice didn't manage to do so. By the time Dutroux was released on March 20th of 1996 and managed to return home, both girls are believed to have been dead, which is a whole other story though. So he buried them in his yard. An untold number of abductions later, he would be caught on August 13th, 1996 with two accomplices and confess before leading police to another basement dungeon where two girls would be rescued from their imprisonment. On the 17th, he would lead them to the bodies of Weinstein, Lejeune, and Rousseau. Police would find the other bodies that were in Jumet a little bit after as well, as a massive number of his homemade rape and torture videos. Many were also found during a search back in 1995, but were never examined for evidence and then just magically disappeared, and the officer who was in charge of that search and their custody was later promoted. There was a ton of little things like this all through the case, including what many believe was a facilitated escape. He would be recaptured though. Countless hairs were found at his various properties in his dungeons, but the judge over the case refused to have them DNA tested, despite the head investigator begging him to have them tested to find out who all might have been involved. At least 7 members of the police force were arrested due to connections to Dutroux. Far from just culpability, ignorance, or corruption from the police was involved though, leading Belgium Senator Anne-Marie Lezin to say, quote, "Dutroux must be a friend of someone important." She also didn't believe that he was a true pedophile, but that when he learned how much people would pay for that sort of material, that's when he started, and he was doing it just to sell it for the top dollar to the real pedophiles. In 2009, WikiLeaks published the Dutroux dossier, prompting Belgium officials to scramble and demand that it be taken down immediately, with the prosecutor general saying that the information was, quote, "involving some people who have done nothing wrong, who have simply been mentioned in an investigation," end quote, and that the material should have remained classified. For the record, do not, I repeat, do not go and look that document up. I'm saying that for your own good. It contains things that I very much so wish that I could unsee and have never, very disturbed to this moment. Don't do it to yourself. If you care about children, if you care about justice, just avoid it. Take my word for it, okay? In October of '96, more than 300,000 Belgians marched through the streets with signs reading, "Stop the cover-up." Between '96 and '98, over a third of Belgians with the surname Dutroux applied to change their name. The first judge was removed for attending a dinner for the victims' families, and therefore deemed not to be impartial, but most believe it was because he had stated that he would publicly release the names of any officials involved in what many believe is an elite pedophile ring in the Belgian government. Dutroux and his accomplice initially supported this, saying that the girls were kidnapped as an order by a third party, but would quickly stop cooperating with police, saying that they had been threatened and couldn't speak on it any further. It was discovered in trial that one detective did collect hair samples that identified at least 25 unknown DNA profiles. Large cash deposits would be traced to an accomplice's bank account, which coincided with the abductions. A letter found in a house belonging to Weinstein discussing a gift to the, quote, high priestess. The note was signed Anubis, a member of a cult called Abraxas, you can go look that up if you want to, was known to have used that name. In the files you will also find, don't go look at it, I'm telling you, that these activities, again, we're talking about child rape, torture, and murder, took place in various castles including, yep, you guessed it, Chateau De Armerois. Several similar and seemingly interconnected scandals would follow, many which tied back to the Socialist Party in Belgium. Belgium's city of Brussels is home to the official council of the European Union and frequently hosts Europe's biggest power brokers, many of them having been named in the dossier. This is where the details of grisly rituals such as, quote, hunting parties would finally surface. This is where abducted children would be released so that they could try and run away into the forest, while masked teams of the European Union elite would subsequently hunt them down, i.e. the most dangerous game. You see, like a lot of things that are shown in movies, is real, and it's being put out like this so that it makes it seem fake or silly, or, in case someone should try to expose it, they won't be taken seriously. More about that later. One of the prosecutors in the case would go on to say it was like something out of the Middle Ages. Not just the disturbing details of the crimes themselves, but the existence of actual satanic cults. And the whole cult of Abraxas is a very deep and disturbing rabbit hole in and of itself. But they worship a demon by that name, and it dates back all the way into Egypt. We may talk about all of that another time, though. What you need to know is that one of their sexual abuse murder rituals would take place at Chateau De Armerois, with the blood collected and used with quills to write an account of what took place in a book that is kept in the basement chapel, the same one with such names as the Rockefellers written in it. After several high-ranking officials and judges were removed from the Belgian government, the Dutroux case would be reopened, which verified many of the alleged events having taken place. Dutroux would be charged with the murder of 11 children and a long list of other crimes in the end. This whole ordeal further serves to verify not only the dark legends of Chateau De Armerois, but speaks to how a system of taping high-ranking officials committing unspeakable crimes and being used as potential blackmail in order to keep secrets safe, people protected, and the system in place exist among both the elites as well as the government. It's very reminiscent of two other cases that you too might be thinking of at this point, and we will get there in part 3, where I will endeavor to finally connect the dots and, to the best of my ability at least, expose the dark system as a whole. Sleep tight out there, curious minds. Try to stay safe, and I'll talk to you all again, hopefully, real soon, on the next Clandestine Radio.